Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today, our guest is Peter Dickinson. He is a Ukraine Alert editor at Atlantic Council, and he is a publisher of Business Ukraine magazine. And Peter is in Ukraine for over 25 years now, like a real veteran of Ukraine-West relations, who has seen all possible challenges and changes in Ukraine. Welcome, Peter.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you that you have found time for this conversation. Now, 25 years after you came to Ukraine, and you have experienced everything. You have experienced all Maidan revolutions. You have experienced the first Russian invasion, the second Russian invasion. Now, 2.5 years almost after the full-scale invasion. How does it feel in Kyiv?
Well, I think there's a huge amount of tiredness at the moment in Kyiv, especially this last month, because of course we've now had the resumption of blackouts, of power cuts, which is a very significant drain on daily life that impacts almost every aspect of daily life. In fact, so people are experiencing long periods without electricity. They're unable to plan their days. They're unable to manage basic tasks in many cases. I'm quite fortunate, relatively speaking, because I live outside town in a house. So those who are living in apartment blocks in particular, it's really challenging. The most obvious and immediate thing that you often hear, and that I think anyone can empathise with, is the lack of elevators. So people living on high floors, people living on the 10th floor of a building, for example, it's extremely challenging for them to go up and down the stairs, and for those with small children or elderly people, those with physical limitations. Obviously, it's a real blow. So that's been a particularly challenging aspect in the last month. And broadly, people are very, very tired. They're exhausted and emotionally exhausted. But having said all of that, there's still a sense that Ukraine has no choice but to go on because the alternative is so desperate. It's so terrible. The idea of Russia taking over the country is still very much in everybody's minds, and I never come across anyone. I don't think there's very many people at all who think like, okay, let's just give up. I don't sense that at all, but I wouldn't underestimate how exhausted people are.
Indeed, that what you have mentioned, this lack of electricity, hours and hours on electricity. It is not that some people imagine, okay, you cannot charge your phone. No, nothing works. Like your refrigerator cannot preserve meat or fish or anything anymore. Like the freezer is not working. Your elevator doesn't work. You cannot bring your purchases to the 10th or the 15th floor of your multi-story house. That also in your district, like the gasoline station cannot sell you gas because the pumps don't work. Your water supply is not existent because pumps cannot pump water to your flat. You cannot even flush your toilet. And for hospitals, of course, they have some amount of diesel fuel for emergency generators, but you cannot run them day by day, like every day. You just cannot afford it. Indeed, it is that what many people in the West don't understand. Thank you very much for having mentioned it. But when we are talking about this situation, when we are now, like many Ukrainians say that this is the consequence of the reluctance of the West to supply Ukraine with everything which is needed for the victory, the fear of escalation, which can come from the Russian side. How much of this Ukrainian perception that the West is partly responsible for this disaster, how much can you share?
Well, I'd be very careful about apportioning blame in terms of saying the West is responsible or the West is at fault. I think fundamentally there is especially amongst Ukrainians, and certainly I would share that there is a sense that the West is not obliged to do anything. The West has its own issues and makes its own decisions, and I wouldn't hold them responsible for things that Russia does. I think we have to always bear in mind that the West could have reacted could have given even less. Let's say that's a reality, and there's no guarantees. There were no guarantees. There are no guarantees that support can't be taken for granted. Having said that, yeah, certainly there is clearly a sense that the West has not given Ukraine what it needs to win. That's I think that's beyond dispute. That's clear, and the key reason for that is because the West is concerned collectively about the danger of Russia escalating the war. And when we say escalation, I mean we mean against them. They're afraid that they will be dragged into the war, that Russia will attack them, that Russia will bring the war to the West, bring the war to the heart of Europe, or attack European countries, and that they don't want that. So although there's a recognition that the West has a clear strategic interest in Ukraine's survival and victory, I would say that there's only so much they want to do because they're afraid of that escalation. They're terrified, in fact, and we've always got to bear in mind there is a huge divide between war and peace, and at the moment Ukraine's on one side of that divide, and the rest of the Western world is on the other, and they will do pretty much anything to prevent being dragged across that divide into the war onto the war side of it.
How much of reality is behind this fear? Like sitting in Kiev, what kind of escalation can you expect from Putin? Like, should Putin order bombing a children's hospital? He has already done it. Should he hijack a nuclear power plant? He has already done it. Should he threaten to kill Western politicians? They do it every day on the state-owned TV.
Well, I think that's a very good point. I mean, what does escalation mean? At this stage, the only thing that Russia is not doing is using nuclear weapons. That is the great escalation. That is like the ultimate escalation, and that is why Russia regularly makes nuclear threats, because they understand that is the one big escalation they have not yet done. They are destroying entire cities. They are deporting, hundreds of thousands of people. They've murdered thousands. They are committing, by virtually any definition, genocide in areas that are under their control. They are bombing Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, attempting to make Ukraine unlivable and depopulate the country. So it's hard to see where the room is for any major escalations in the scale of the conflict, except the use of nuclear weapons. But I think from the Western point of view, when they talk about escalation, they're not talking about Ukraine. They're talking about their own country. What they actually mean is, when they say we don't want to escalate, what they mean is we don't want the war to come to us, which is a very different thing, and then the question becomes, would Russia really risk that or not? And that's a separate discussion, really.
Talking about this bringing war to Europe, Russia is already doing it or has done it. We know that Russian agents tried to kill or have killed persons in Europe, starting with the Skripals in the United Kingdom, or assassination attempt on a Bulgarian businessman who supplied Ukraine with artillery shells. We know that Russia was behind explosives, explosions on Czechia's warehouses with artillery shells. We know that right now Russia has tried to attack American bases in Germany, where Ukrainian troops were trained, and 2 Russian citizens have been arrested in Germany, in Bavaria, recently for plotting terrorist attempt. And they planned as assassination of CEO of Rheinmetall, Germany's largest, or one of largest Germany's arms producers. So this war is already here. How can the West believe that being reluctant will spare them from Russia's fury when Russia already sees the West as a target?
Well, I think it's partly because they are short-term in their mindset. The average Western politician does not think in terms of years or decades. They think in terms of weeks and months. They're looking to get through the immediate period, the current election cycle, as it were, and to make sure that there's no major scandals on their watch. Now, what happens further down the line could come back to haunt them in the future, but that's not really their primary concern. Their main concern is to keep their job at the moment, to avoid being dragged into any major scandals, and to avoid making life more difficult for their constituents. That's the short-termism that I think certainly the Russians exploit very, very skillfully. I think one of the Russians' great skills is the ability to play on the West's fear and the West's comfort. The West is in a comfort zone, relatively speaking, and they wish to stay there. And Russia is very good at exploiting that. And as you rightly say, Russia is very actively increasing the temperature, increasing the level of their hybrid hostilities, with political assassinations, with sabotage operations, with cyber operations, and so on and so forth. And they will continue to do that. That's part of their warning. That's a way of them saying, you see, we do this, we'll do more. And if you don't do what we say, if you cross our red lines, we'll go even further. Now, whether that means they'll actually go to the level of conventional warfare, I think is very debatable and probably quite doubtful. But they certainly could go a lot further than they have already. And they, I'm sure, behind closed doors, they let the West know that. And actually, maybe that's even redundant. The West is more than capable of understanding that themselves. And they don't want to disrupt their comfortable life. And frankly, why should they? They're living in a peacetime environment. They have a lot of issues to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And they'd really much rather that the Russian threat just went away. And if they could make it go away by appeasing Russia in Ukraine, now that's a pretty reasonable price to pay, I think a lot of Western politicians believe.
Indeed, that is a scary situation, and I'm pretty sure, I think you're absolutely right, that the Russians threaten the Western politicians behind the closed doors with all what they can, and that is what Putin is personally very skilled in. He was a KGB agent, and KGB business is threatening people, manipulating people, spreading fears, and then getting from the people what the KGB wants to get from them. We are talking to Peter Dickinson, who is Ukraine Alert editor at Atlantic Council, and he's a publisher of Business Ukraine magazine. He lives in Ukraine for over 25 years by now. And if you don't want to miss interviews like this, don't forget to like, to share, and to subscribe to this channel. Peter, look, you are in Ukraine constantly, and you have a lot of contacts in the business community. What is the mood of the Western businesses in Ukraine? The war is already in its third year of full-scale war, 11th year of the war itself. Those businesses who wanted to leave Ukraine have done it already. What do people say who stayed in Ukraine?
Well, there's a huge amount of resilience, a huge amount of creativity, and I would say quite a lot of determination as well. There were a lot of businesses that initially that left the country or that were forced to shut down operations. But then after that, I think after the first few months, those who remained, I think, have continued to operate and have kind of stabilized. The initial shocks caused a lot of very hard decisions, a lot of rethinking. There were massive disruptions to things like logistics, to things like logistical chains, supply chains. There were huge challenges in terms of human resources. A lot of people were displaced, were moved around the country or left the country. Those businesses that involve significant workforces had issues with people being mobilized into the army. That continues as well now. But overall, I think there's been a stabilization at first, probably in the first year, and then now we're seeing sort of creative responses, innovations, new approaches to challenges. People are certainly not sitting around and just waiting and just saying, well, let's wait and see and wait till the war is over or wait till the situation improves. They're trying to move things along. There are some investments, not a huge amount of investment, but you do see them. Companies that have had damage of rebuilding factories, reopening production facilities. I was at the opening just yesterday of a big Turkish company. It opened a generator production facility in the Kyiv region with a $50 million investment. So these things are happening. They're quite isolated, but they're going on across the country. And in general, I would say, this idea that people say, okay, this is the reality now. It might be the reality for a long time. There's no guarantee this war will end, this year or in 6 months or even in a year's time. So if we're going to be here, we need to continue operating. We need to continue working. I can say from my own business experience, I publish a business magazine, and I have done for many years, and previous crises, going back as far as 2008 and then the global crash, and then the Euromaidan revolution and the Russian invasion of Crimea. The first thing that tends to go in these major crises is marketing budgets, is advertising budgets. So obviously as a publisher, that's something I feel very acutely. And this time, I think the hit has been a lot less. People have been much more robust in the sense they're saying, okay, you know what, we're going to continue we're going to continue with our communications. We're going to continue advertising, and so from my business point of view, it's actually been very, very, very encouraging to see that people are investing still in that part of their business. So it's clearly a signal that they have a long-term view to be in Ukraine. They plan to be around, and they see a future here. They see things developing. The one point I would make as well, the one perhaps final point on this issue is that, as well as the obvious, the very, very severe negative impact of the war and the ongoing problems that creates, you've also got in parallel the Ukraine making very significant progress towards European Union membership over the last few years. And that creates very interesting opportunities from a business point of view, because people understand that Ukraine is now on quite a firm footing, on quite a firm trajectory towards the European Union. And once that happens, in fact, already it's happening, but once the membership process is complete within the next 5 to 10 years, of course, that will have a massive impact on the business environment here. That will be, that will open up the country in many ways economically. And there is a sense when a lot of the people you speak to in the business community saying, well, you know what, that's something that's also keeping us very motivated, because we want to be anchored here in a good position for when that comes.
What you mentioned, I think it's extremely important thing that many people in the West, they believe that if there is a normal, peaceful life in some areas of Ukraine, that means that there is no war, or that means that people don't care. But it is not the case. Like, we lived in the West for decades without any war. We have forgotten how life during the war looks like. But during the World War II, there was a front line with battle on the front. But even along the front, people had their free time when they wanted to have to do something else. And of course, in the cities behind the front line, there were times when people were hiding in the bomb shelter because of the bomb raids, and when people worked at military factories. But in the evening, they went with their friends somewhere to just get a taste of their normal life. That is what people do in Ukraine as well. And businesses need to run. You need to run hospitals. People need to buy clothes. People need to go to cinema, etc. And that is how it looks like. But currently, when we read news lines about Ukrainian daily life, there is a huge discussion about mobilization and rotation of troops. How do you feel this discussion in Ukraine?
Well, when the full-scale invasion began, I think Ukraine had around 300,000, maybe 350,000 troops in uniform at that time, and a large pool of veterans also to call upon. But there was a massive flood of volunteers. I think around over 500,000, I think, were signed up within the first week or so, and there were many more also who were in line, who were told, no, you have to go and wait, we'll call you, don't call us, we'll call you, and sort of put them on the waiting list. So Ukraine's army more than doubled. I mean, now they have somewhere in the region between around, I think, 900,000 and 1 million people in uniform in the military itself, in the defense forces, and certain elements of the interior ministry troops and so forth. So it's a huge army already. But they do need to get a lot more troops in order to be able to rotate people and allow people to take a break. Because a lot of the troops now have been on the front lines for almost 2.5 years now, with very little respite. And there's also, I think, there's a misconception that all Ukrainian soldiers are all on the front line in trenches. Actually, around 80 to 90% of them are in rear positions and doing other roles. The actual number of troops on the front lines is probably closer to 100,000. It's a lot less than the overall total. It's quite a small percentage. So one of the challenges that the military faces now, or has faced for the last, especially since Syrskyi was made the commander-in-chief and Zaluzhny was removed at the beginning of this year, has been to make sure that all the soldiers within the army are sharing the burden, as it were, of combat, that there's a rotation going on within the troops, so that we don't have the same units on the front line all the time, because they simply burn out. Of course, casualty levels are very high and losses are very high, but even beyond that, people just mentally burn out. There's only so much of the very, very intense combat that any human being can take before they simply are no longer able to function as a soldier, or even as a person, frankly speaking. So it's a major issue. And the pool of, like, the sort of the most eager volunteers, as it were, they're already there. So what you've got now is those who are duty bound to serve, and a lot of people who don't want to serve, who have no interest in serving, who do not feel obliged to, do not want to, or simply scared to serve. it's very mixed. Some people I speak to say, if I'm called, I'll go. Some people I know have literally taken to home and do not go out anymore and just stay in their house. Since the government introduced the new mobilization regulations in May, so around 2 months ago, I think that they've released figures just recently. I think around 5 million people have registered with that new service. So we're not talking about scraping the barrel at this point. I mean, we've got about 1 million in uniform. There's around 5 million potential soldiers also registered in the reserve, as it were, on the digital reserve. So I think those people are going to start to go through the system now. Some will be called up, others won't be, and there's many millions more who could be called up. It's certainly not popular. I think that the most unpopular aspect, or perhaps the biggest criticism I would have, is it's not being very transparently handled. So a lot of people don't know what the regulations mean for them, and they're scared. Simply, they're scared. Of course, they see on the news, they see on social media, the high casualty levels, the very heavy fighting that's going on, and they're afraid that they will just be thrown into the front. So the government communications has not been great on this. I think they've not been able to explain to people very clearly how it works, who will be called up, and also the fact that now the new regulations, people have a very high amount of leeway in choosing where they'll serve, in what type of function they'll serve in. Which is extremely unusual for any army in a war to be able to say, okay, I'd like to do this, or I'd like to be in that role. But they do actually have that opportunity now. Many people don't recognise that and think they're simply just going to be thrown into the trenches, somewhere around Avdiivka or Bakhmut or some other very hot spot on the front lines. And of course, the Russians are very, very expertly exploiting this via social media, putting out a lot of negative information about people being press ganged, rounded up on the streets, thrown into the front lines, and killed. And so that's probably one of Russia's most successful information operations inside Ukraine. They've been very good at playing on the existing fears. They didn't invent these fears, but they've been very good at exploiting that and creating a sense of panic. So you do get people now who are saying, you know what? I'm not going to leave my apartment. I'm going to sit in my apartment. I'm going to go out, occasionally to the shops. I'm going to come back and for months on end. And then there are other people who say, whatever, I'm going to leave my ordinary life. And so, if you walk around Kyiv, I don't think there's any real, you don't have a strong sense that there's all of a sudden there's no men on the streets or something like that. You see people all the time of a military age, but there are a lot of instances that I'm personally aware of people doing that, saying, I am afraid that I'll be thrown into the front line, so I'm not going to go out. The one area I think where there's been success that I think is worth noting is in the individual recruitment from certain units. A number of units have sort of said, you know what, we don't think the system works very well. We don't have a lot of faith in the system, and they've literally begun recruiting via, like executive recruitment, headhunting essentially. And you see adverts all over town, and they are very transparent. They're actually showing how it should be done, and they say, okay, you want to be a drone operator, you want to be a driver, you want to be in the tank division, whatever it may be. And they are getting a lot of recruits. In many cases, these individual units, they have waiting lists. They have hundreds of people applying every month, and they're able to pick and choose and get the best people, because these people know, well, you know what, I might get called up. I'd rather go to a good unit with a good reputation, which has good commanders and allows me to actually do something I think I could be good at and useful at doing. So I think that's the model that the rest of the army needs to try and replicate.
Indeed, those who travel to Ukraine regularly see these billboards of recruiting campaigns of certain brigades, and they compete for recruits like companies compete on the free market for the engineers, or like other experts, like BMW competing against the Ford company, and Samsung competes against Apple. And that is how it looks like in Ukraine. Absolutely untypical for many armies, where at least you can apply for a certain type of troops like Air Force or like Army or Navy, but you cannot say, I want to go to the 47th Brigade and I want to be that and that and that soldier. But in Ukraine you can do it. And they even found some brigades, they even found stars like Sergej Sumlenny, who volunteered for Khartia Brigade, and now he's one of faces of Khartia recruitment process. He fights on the front, but he also explains people how this recruitment process goes, because he went through the same recruitment process. That is indeed absolutely different in Ukraine compared to other armies, but other armies are not facing the same challenges like Ukraine's army. But Peter, what do you think is Ukraine's strategy for win in this war? Last year, there was a huge hope for a counteroffensive, which has failed, unfortunately, due to Russia's well-prepared defensive lines and lack of certain types of arms. What is Ukraine's strategy for this year?
Well, this year the strategy is all about defense and attrition. It's all about holding what Ukraine currently has, not conceding too much ground to the Russians, and attriting the Russians, inflicting very, very heavy losses on the Russians to try and wear Russia down as much as possible, while Ukraine is able to build up its own strength in terms of troops, in terms of weapons, in terms of training, in terms of its armaments, across the board. So there's no real counteroffensive planning underway, as far as I'm aware, and certainly from the people I speak to within the military at this point. They're just looking to sort of consolidate this year, regroup, regain their strength, and at the same time wear down Russia's strength as much as possible. And I think if we look at the front lines, this strategy is actually working to a degree. It's very hard to assess how badly Russia is being hit. The figures that come out are always questioned. Of course, it's always a very partisan issue exactly how accurate the losses are. But many of the intelligence agencies seem to be in agreement that Russia in recent months has suffered its heaviest losses of the war. The available evidence would certainly seem to support that. The Kharkiv offensive in particular seems to have been extremely costly for the Russians, but virtually all their offensive operations are. I mean, their meat assaults are now, notorious and well documented. We saw that at Bakhmut, we saw that at Avdiivka, and we've seen it in Kharkiv. And collectively, if we take those three major offensives going back to, like a year and a half now, Russia's gains can be measured in single kilometers, maybe tens of kilometers in some areas. But on the scale of a country as big as Ukraine, that's almost nothing. It's negligible, and they've lost hundreds of thousands of troops and a great quantity of armor, weapons, and ammunition. So the attrition front is as grim and brutal as that is. It does look like Ukraine is gaining there and is actually achieving what it wishes to. We look at the map, we can see that Russia's not making very significant gains. There's certainly been no major breakthroughs. So it looks like it's working per se. But of course, you don't win wars by holding the front. You don't win wars by making minor retreats. You have to retake land. And that is a major task that Ukraine has ahead of it that realistically, I think they will not even try to approach until perhaps next spring, perhaps even later than that. The estimates that I hear in terms of Ukraine's weapons supplies, which are very heavily, of course, dependent on the West, is that the Western manufacturing will not really have geared up to be on a level, to be on a par or above Russia until next spring. It's a very, very slow process. The wheels are turning, but we might start to see that by next spring, perhaps next summer, where Ukraine actually has advantages in key areas like artillery. At the moment, the only area I think where Ukraine has managed to gain a real advantage is in terms of drone manufacturing and drone usage, and that's been one of Ukraine's great strong points, I think. But again, you can't realistically launch an offensive using these little drones. They're very good for zapping things that are coming your way and stopping attacks and making sure you've got great visibility. But they are not. They don't give you the firepower, the oomph that you need to break through and really make the gains Ukraine needs. So that's how I see it this year. It's about holding on. It's about holding the fort, as it were, holding the lines, and inflicting as heavy losses as possible on the Russians.
That is indeed the question which many ask. Is Ukraine capable to constantly stay in this defensive position with the current level of supply of ammunition and arms? And what happens if a larger player, like, for example, the United States, suddenly cuts or significantly reduces its support? Europe is not capable to substitute the US. So can Ukraine really win this war of attrition if there will be no significant increase of providing Ukraine with arms quantitatively and qualitatively? And is not it exactly that what Russia hopes to use as their strategy for victory?
Absolutely, that is Russia's strategy for victory. Russia's strategy is just to outlast the West and to gradually wear Ukraine down, to overwhelm Ukraine like a very large, essentially like a much larger opponent, sort of smothering their very strong, very determined, and very skillful opponent, Ukraine in this case, but just a hugely large opponent, just smothering them basically slowly but surely. That's essentially what we're looking at from a Russian perspective, and that is traditionally how Russia has won its wars in the past. I mean, that's what they tend to do. They tend to rely on this brute force, and they have a very, very high tolerance for losses. People often talk about speak in horror about the scale of Russia's losses, but I don't see that much horror coming from Russia, and I don't think that they are genuinely that horrified by it. I think they just take it as normal. The Russians are careful, of course, to make sure that the people they're losing are the people they can afford to lose. They're not losing many middle-class kids from Moscow or St. Petersburg. They're making sure they're only losing members of the criminal class, members of the underclass, people from small, like one-horse towns in the middle of Siberia, and ethnic minorities, Russian ethnic minorities. So they're very careful to make sure they pick their cannon fodder. They're very selective about who they throw into the mix, into the meat grinder. But that is their strategy. They are trying to wear Ukraine down, and they do believe, I think, that at some point the Western resolve will weaken, will break. Russia has very good reason for thinking that. That has been the case in every other confrontation that Putin has had since he became president, or every other every other engagement he's had with the West for more than 20 years. The West makes various noises about democracy and freedom and values. And then at a certain point, they say, well, never mind, let's get back to business as usual. Let's get back to making money. Let's get some more of that cheap gas. Let's get some more of that Russian corruption. This is what we're all about, and this is what we want. And Putin is very confident that that will happen again at some point. Now, whether that's because Donald Trump wins the presidency in America, or whether that's because the situation changes in Europe, or the European Union becomes overwhelmed by populists or right-wing populists of the Le Pen brand, or the Alternative for Deutschland, or any of these other groups. There is a very strong, I think, not only hope but a sort of belief in Russia that will happen. There's only a matter of time. And so all the Russians got to do is hold on. They will get what they want to get, and their tactics are quite clear. They want to overwhelm Ukraine gradually with the sheer weight in numbers, and while they're doing it, also to hammer Ukraine's infrastructure, to make Ukraine unlivable or as uncomfortable as possible for the civilian population, so that there's also a domestic unrest or dissatisfaction or disillusionment within Ukraine, and people in Ukraine saying, you know what, we've had enough. Let's just stop this, because we can't go on living like this. That's where Russia's at. I don't think the Russians are looking for a military miracle here. I think their strategy is clear. They are trying to go for the long war, which is their great strength. Which is, frankly speaking, what the logical thing for them to do. Can Ukraine defeat that? That's the big. That so much depends on Western support. Frankly, if America says no, we're out. If Trump turns around and says, you know what, we're done, it's going to be extremely difficult. That's a fact. Europe can't replace America fully. They could replace parts of it if they were fully committed, which they're not. They could maybe make up, I don't know, 50 to 70% of it, perhaps, of what America's loss would mean. But that would require a huge effort from Europe, which also would have a finite time frame, couldn't go on forever. So it would be, the stakes in America could not be higher for Ukraine. That's hugely important. If the Americans continue to support Ukraine, if the Europeans stay firm, then Ukraine, I think, has a good chance of remaining in the fight and gaining back at least some of the territory that it's lost, and putting themselves in a better position for some sort of negotiations. Retaking all of the land that's lost is going to be a huge challenge militarily. I think, as well as the other point I would make is, as well as the weapons that the West provides, another huge factor is the restrictions on Ukraine. The restrictions in place on Ukraine's ability to attack targets inside Russia. Now, that has really made a sort of mockery of the rules of war, and created a very an absurd situation where Russia has like a safe haven inside Russia to attack Ukraine at will, and Ukraine can't strike back. Now, as long as that goes on, even if Ukraine has all the weapons in the world, they're going to have trouble winning the war because Russia will always be able to strike at them, at will from distance. And until Ukraine is able to take the fight more to Russia, that really is challenging. I think that would be a huge shift in the war if Ukraine were given that right, at least on a partial basis, maybe territorially within a certain area of Russia, or maybe within limitations on certain types of targets. But it would make a huge difference to the war, and it would bring the war home to Russia. But at the moment, there doesn't seem to be any movement on that at all. There was no movement at the NATO summit, and I think that was telling, because that's where it would have been the most logical time to do it.
Exactly. Then we are coming back to the topic of fear of escalation. And I'm pretty sure if Ukraine, or when Ukraine will start the next offensive, and if we imagine that Ukraine army would come closer to Crimea, I'm pretty sure in the West, especially in my country, Germany, there will be a lot of voices of the politicians, maybe even from our federal chancellor, who would say, oh no, please don't attack Crimea, don't enter Crimea because this is red line for Russia. Don't make them angry because we don't know what will happen after that. That is indeed Ukraine is fighting with at least one hand tied behind its back.
Yeah, Crimea is an interesting one because I think at the beginning of the war, there was huge concern in the West about attacks on Crimea. Everybody knew that Crimea was the kind of jewel in the crown of Putin's big new Russian empire. It was his greatest achievement. It was his moment of glory. It was a symbol of Russia's revival as a great power. And they were aware, this sort of mystical quality of Crimea, this sort of legendary, the sort of myth making around Crimea was so strong in the Kremlin propaganda that a lot of people in the West were very concerned. Like, if Ukraine tries to attack Crimea, then it's going to be World War III. We don't know exactly what the restrictions were, but there was certainly a lot of reticence there. But Ukraine ignored that essentially. They went head on. They attacked Crimea. And they've been very successful. They've been extremely successful. And the more successful they've been, the more clear it's been that there is no great red line, that Russia will not respond in any dramatic way to these attacks. And they've forced the Russian Black Sea Fleet to retreat, to withdraw from Crimea, almost without any fanfare. I think it's actually very important to underline that the Russians haven't made a big deal out of this. They've actually very clearly the Kremlin has said to the Russian propaganda apparatus, keep quiet, don't talk about this, don't publicize the fact that our ships are being sunk, don't publicize the fact that we're withdrawing our warships from Crimea, don't talk about it at all because it's embarrassing for us. But we will do it, we will withdraw, and they have done that. And I think that the West has seen that. The lesson is clear. The Russia's threats are largely bluffs. Russia understands if military realities go against them, they will have to withdraw, and they will do so. They won't resort to Armageddon, nuclear Armageddon, or any of these blustering threats that we hear coming from Putin. On the contrary, they will pull back and they will be very quiet about it. So I think that's been very telling, but the West is still reluctant to fully take that on. I think they have, in fairness, said, okay, there's now now it's accepted by all of Ukraine's allies, including the US, that attacks on Crimea are entirely legitimate, and that's fine. And there's no question about any restrictions in place there, which is progress actually compared to the very beginning of the war. But we need to apply the same logic to Russia itself if we want to see the real breakthroughs in the war towards victory.
Indeed, and we have seen that also U.S. provided ATACMS missiles have hit Russian sovereign territory in Bryansk region or in Kursk region, where Russian army was stationed and tried to hit the region of Kharkiv from there, not tried, hit region Kharkiv from there, and nothing happened. Like, there were a lot of hot air, a lot of threats from Medvedev, from Putin, from other representatives of Russian state, and none of these threats was fulfilled. So, as you said before, there are a lot of talk, a lot of threatening, a lot of psychological warfare. But when it comes to real strikes, Russia knows very well where they need to pull back. So, what do you think? Will the jets, which Ukraine, we all hope, will finally get, because there were so many promises that Ukraine will get the jets as soon as possible.
Yeah.
We hope that will happen finally. Do you think that the jets will help Ukraine to not to completely change, but to improve their situation?
Well, I think the first thing. I mean, let's wait for them to arrive first of all, because we've been hearing that they're about to arrive for a year now, and so it's become almost farcical. Now they say we expect the jets to arrive in September. My first question is which September? This September? Next September? It's at that scale. It's at that. We've reached that point now. So it's let's wait for them to arrive. But I mean, I think the first thing the first thing to say is we're not talking about huge numbers here. Ukraine is already complaining or grumbling and saying, we're not getting enough. And I think that's clear. It's not going to be enough. But let's see. I mean, let's see how many they get. I think the first thing that we will notice from these jets, the first role they will play, will be actually in air defense. I mean, the best thing, one of the great advantages of these sort of jets is they're very useful for protecting the airspace, and therefore, so they will play a very important role in strengthening Ukraine's air defences, alongside the NASAMS and of course the Patriot systems that Ukraine has got and is getting. The F-16s will really help to bolster the air defences and keep the country much safer, which is absolutely crucial. Again, air defences don't win wars, but if Ukraine's airspace is not defended, they're perpetually at threat of having their infrastructure knocked out. If the air defenses become stronger and they are more protected, of course, then they can really focus more on rebuilding their energy sector, on doing more in terms of infrastructure, and perhaps also getting other aspects of the business sector going again, because they can say, look, we're safe. We've got a reliable air coverage. Now, you're never going to get 100% reliability, but you can get a much higher level of reliability if you have more of the Patriot systems in country, and you have squadrons of F-16s that are always up there and ready to jump up into the air whenever Russia launches attacks. So that's, I think, going to be the first thing that people, we shouldn't expect the F-16s to all of a sudden sweep down on the battlefield and clear the front lines. I think they're going to primarily be used for air defense at first. But they will have a role on the front lines and in the battle as well. They'll push the Russians back further. They'll make it more difficult for the Russians to use the glide bombs that have been so devastating this year, and that the Russians are using to hammer Ukrainian frontline cities and also fortifications. So they'll be used in that area. And of course, ultimately, if they get enough F-16s, we will also see, I think, the Ukraine will have the ability, hopefully, to be able to establish local air superiority at certain points. They won't have the numbers to be able to establish air superiority across the whole country, because Russia has such a massive advantage in terms of air force, in the number of jets they have and their capabilities in general in the air. But I think Ukraine we'll be talking about air defences will be very much improved. Russia will be forced to pull back some of its own offensive capabilities, and Ukraine will hopefully have the potential to establish localized air superiority, which could lead to breakthroughs at various points on the front. So that could be that's really looking ahead to next year, when they also have hopefully the armaments and the weaponry in place and the trained soldiers. Then we can again look at perhaps some sort of strategic offensives at various points on the front, with the F-16s playing a key role.
Indeed, and everything once again is interconnected. More air defense means a better working economy, calmer life of the population, less damage for energy system, more efficient production of weapons as well, and more chances to prepare for the next offensive, which is absolutely necessary for liberation, because, as you said before, no war has been won by defense. Only you always need, on a certain point of time, start with your offensive to liberate your territory and your people, which is much more important. Thank you so much. It was Peter Dickinson, who is Ukraine Alert editor at Atlantic Council, and he's a publisher of Business Ukraine magazine, living in Ukraine since over 25 years already, a quarter of a century. My gosh. Thank you so much for your insights. Stay strong, stay with Ukraine. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
And don't forget to like, to share, and to subscribe to this channel so you will never miss such interview like this.